On a Tuesday night inside Georgetown's neo-Gothic Gaston Hall, 1,500 climate believers showed up to worship a movement and left watching it fracture in real time. The speaker didn't bring a debate. He brought receipts. A first-class charge, a luxury EV, a campaign payment trail, and one question that changed the room. Do you live by the rules you demand? The room did not feel like a place where political careers end. It felt like a celebration that had already decided its outcome before the doors even opened. Georgetown University's Gaston Hall was packed wall to wall with students, activists, faculty, and organizers who believed they were about to witness another victory lap for the most recognizable progressive voice of their generation. The energy was not skeptical, not adversarial, but devotional. The kind of collective anticipation that only appears when a movement believes it is on the right side of history. No one in that auditorium arrived expecting confrontation, let alone collapse. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into that space, carrying the full weight of what she represented to those students. To them, she was not merely a member of Congress, but proof that the system could be cracked open by someone young, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge entrenched power. She was the former bartender who embarrassed party elders, the lawmaker who spoke fluently about climate justice, inequality, and moral urgency in a language that felt personal rather than procedural. For many in the room, she was the reason they joined an organization, knocked on doors, skipped classes, or believed politics could still mean something beyond cynicism. The event itself had been framed as a moment of affirmation rather than interrogation. Promotional posters promised an evening about solutions, urgency, and generational responsibility, not a hostile exchange about personal conduct. 3 student organizations had pooled resources to host what they saw as a defining campus moment, one that would energize their peers and flood social media with clips of inspiration rather than controversy. Tickets disappeared in hours, lines formed by mid-afternoon, and the crowd that filled the hall reflected exactly the demographic that had powered Ocasio-Cortez's rise. This was, by every conventional measure, her safest possible room. What no one in the audience understood yet was that the night's most consequential figure was not on the stage. He was seated quietly toward the back of the auditorium, dressed plainly, holding a tablet and a thin folder that had taken weeks to assemble. He did not arrive to challenge climate science, debate policy frameworks, or deliver a partisan speech that could be easily dismissed. He arrived with publicly available records, financial disclosures, archived statements, and a single strategic intention. He wanted to ask whether the standards being demanded of the public were being lived by the person demanding them. That distinction matters because what unfolded was not a policy argument in the traditional sense. It was not a left versus right clash over ideology, nor a familiar cable news shouting match designed for instant outrage. It was something far more destabilizing for a political brand built on moral clarity. The questions that would soon be asked did not challenge what Ocasio-Cortez believed, but whether her personal choices aligned with the sacrifices she urged others to accept. The discomfort that followed did not come from disagreement, but from recognition. The opening 40 minutes of the evening reinforced every expectation the audience had brought with them. Ocasio-Cortez spoke with confidence and fluency about the climate crisis, systemic inequality, and the urgency of collective action. She framed the issue as one of moral responsibility rather than partisan identity, emphasizing that delay carried real human costs. Her delivery was polished without feeling scripted, urgent without feeling panicked, and it drew the kind of sustained engagement that only comes when a speaker knows her audience instinctively. Applause rose and fell on cue, and by the time she concluded, the hall was on its feet. It was only when the floor opened for questions that the tone subtly shifted. The first sign of tension was not the content of the question, but who was asking it. When the Speaker of the House stood and requested the microphone, the reaction was immediate and mixed, a blend of boos, murmurs, and uneasy laughter. This was not supposed to be his room, and the instinctive assumption was that whatever followed would be performative or easily deflected. The expectation was that the crowd would rally, the moment would turn viral in her favor, and the interruption would only strengthen her standing. Instead, the opening question reframed the entire night. It did not accuse or insult, and it did not raise its voice. It asked, calmly and precisely, how the principles articulated moments earlier were applied in practice. It referenced her own words about consumption, travel, and sacrifice, and then placed them alongside entries from disclosures she herself had filed, as required by law. The contrast was not introduced as an allegation, but as a request for explanation, and that distinction stripped away the usual defenses. As the exchange continued, the room began to change in ways that were visible even from the stage. Phones lowered instead of rising, whispers replaced cheers, and attention shifted from affirmation to evaluation. The discomfort did not come from learning something entirely new, but from seeing familiar information arranged in a way that forced a different conclusion. Each example, whether about travel, lifestyle, or campaign spending, was presented not as proof of wrongdoing, but as a question of consistency. And consistency, more than ideology, is what movements rely on to maintain trust. This was the moment where the evening crossed an invisible line. It stopped being a lecture about climate justice and became a test of credibility in front of the very people who had granted it. The audience was no longer listening as supporters waiting to be inspired, but as participants trying to reconcile belief with evidence. The tension in the room was not manufactured by volume or theatrics, but by the slow realization that the questions could not be waved away without consequences. What followed would ripple far beyond that hall, but the significance of the opening lay in this precise shift. A forum designed to reinforce faith became a mirror held up to the movement's most recognizable face. The issue was no longer whether the policies were right, but whether the messenger was living within the moral framework she had constructed. And once that question entered the room, it could not be escorted back out. This is how political narratives unravel in the modern era, not through secret recordings or hidden scandals, but through public records reframed in public spaces. The opening of that night mattered because it demonstrated how quickly admiration can turn into scrutiny when values and behavior appear misaligned. To understand why the fallout was so severe, and why it resonated so deeply with her own supporters, you have to understand that the challenge was not external. It came from inside the belief system itself, and that is always where the most lasting damage begins. The reason the moment detonated the way it did was not because of who asked the questions, but because of where and how they were asked. This was not a congressional hearing with hostile members lined up for partisan combat, and it was not a television studio where sound bites could be trimmed and reframed by friendly producers. It was a room full of young people who believed they were aligned with the speaker not just politically, but morally. When expectations are that high, even a small fracture can feel seismic. Mike Johnson did not challenge the premise of climate change or the need for environmental reform, and that choice was deliberate. He did not attack the Green New Deal as unrealistic or economically reckless, arguments his audience would have rejected instantly. Instead, he framed his intervention around implementation, the least abstract and most personal dimension of policy advocacy. By narrowing the focus to lived behavior, he moved the debate from ideology to credibility, a terrain where applause cannot substitute for answers. The first example he raised, the San Francisco trip, seemed almost trivial at first glance. Members of Congress travel constantly, and few people begrudge them the logistical compromises that come with national responsibilities. But Johnson's framing stripped away that assumption by anchoring the trip in her own rhetoric about unnecessary air travel. The issue was not that she flew, but that she had publicly argued that no one should fly across the country for non-essential reasons. Once that contrast was established, the details mattered in a way they ordinarily would not. Flying first class did not matter as a luxury choice until it was placed next to the claim that people must reduce consumption and accept discomfort for the planet. The dollar figures mattered not because they were shocking on their own, but because they illustrated a gap between preached sacrifice and practiced convenience. When the projection screen displayed a charge that was both precise and familiar in format, it removed any ambiguity about whether this was rumor or record. The room's silence reflected recognition, not confusion. At that point, the conversation shifted from abstract principle to personal accountability, and that shift was irreversible. Questions about privacy were answered with references to disclosure requirements, which diffused any suggestion of illicit access. The fact that the information was self-reported mattered more than the information itself. It reframed the exchange as one about interpretation rather than intrusion, and it limited the available escape routes. Once that door opened, the subsequent examples landed with increasing force. The Tesla purchase was not introduced as hypocrisy in isolation, but as a contradiction embedded in earlier statements about luxury consumption. The specificity of the price point was critical because it mirrored her own language about what constituted excess. Johnson did not argue that electric vehicles were bad, a point that would have derailed the conversation into technical debate. He argued that she had drawn a line and then crossed it herself. The discussion of battery supply chains marked a turning point because it expanded the frame from personal comfort to global ethics. Child labor in mineral extraction is not a niche concern among progressive activists, and the audience understood that immediately. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. It was heavier, more reflective. This was no longer about flights or fashion, but about moral complicity in systems she had condemned. Importantly, Johnson did not accuse her of knowingly endorsing exploitation, and that restraint mattered. He asked whether she had known, and when she had learned, allowing the audience to fill in the ethical implications themselves. The citation of a well-documented report gave the claim weight without theatrics. The reaction in the room suggested that many were encountering this contradiction for the first time, and the discomfort was palpable. The Met Gala example landed differently, not because it was more serious, but because it was more symbolic. That image had been celebrated as a moment of protest embedded in spectacle, a clever use of access to send a message. By reframing it as participation rather than resistance, Johnson challenged the narrative that intention alone absolves contradiction. The estimated cost of the dress mattered because it translated symbolism into material reality. What unsettled the audience was not the existence of wealth or access, but the perceived asymmetry between message and milieu. The idea that protest could occur from inside elite spaces had always been contentious, but it had largely gone unexamined by supporters. Seeing it articulated as performance rather than disruption forced a re-evaluation. The contrast with protesters outside the event sharpened that discomfort by presenting an alternative that aligned more closely with professed values. Housing costs and dual residences introduced a different kind of tension, one rooted in policy specificity. Ocasio-Cortez had built a reputation on precise metrics about affordability and income ratios, which made those same metrics applicable to her own situation. The numbers were not presented to shame, but to highlight selective application. This was a subtle but effective move because it used her analytical framework rather than imposing an external one. The argument was not that she should live ascetically or reject professional necessities. It was that once you define ethical thresholds publicly, you implicitly accept scrutiny when you cross them. The suggestion that alternative arrangements existed undermined claims of inevitability. What might have been dismissed as nitpicking instead became a case study in choice. Campaign finance questions escalated the stakes because they implicated supporters directly. Donors in the room were no longer observers, but participants whose contributions were being traced through disclosures. The sums involved were significant enough to provoke emotional responses without being so large as to seem abstract. The fact that the payments were legal did not resolve the ethical unease, and Johnson's insistence on that distinction sharpened rather than softened the critique. The reference to relationships transformed the issue from structural to personal, and the reaction in the audience reflected that shift. Paying associates with campaign funds is common practice, but it carries reputational risk when transparency collides with expectation. Supporters who had donated out of belief in a different kind of politics now faced the uncomfortable realization that their money had flowed through familiar channels. The resulting tension was not easily deflected by appeals to legality. As voices from the audience joined the exchange, the dynamic changed again. This was no longer a dialogue between two political figures, but a collective reckoning. The questions were not hostile in tone, but they were persistent, and they came from people who wanted to believe the answers. That desire made the absence of clear resolution more damaging than overt confrontation would have been. Ocasio-Cortez's attempts to reframe the exchange as an ambush resonated with some, but not enough to halt the momentum. The fact that the questions were grounded in public records made the ambush framing less persuasive. An ambush implies deception or bad faith, and neither was evident in the materials presented. The room's fragmentation reflected a loss of narrative control rather than a victory for the challenger. When she left the stage, the symbolism was unmistakable. Departure communicated finality in a way words could not. The empty podium and the frozen projection screen created an image that circulated far beyond the room, detached from its original context. What might have been a difficult conversation became a defining visual. The decision by Johnson to remain and continue answering questions compounded the impact. It signaled that the issue was not personal conflict but unresolved inquiry. Students who stayed were not endorsing his politics. They were seeking clarity. The extended walkthrough of disclosures transformed the event from confrontation into seminar, reinforcing the perception that this was an examination rather than a spectacle. As clips spread online, the narrative evolved in ways her team could not fully manage. Conservative commentators amplified the exposure, but the more consequential reactions came from within progressive circles. Expressions of disappointment carried more weight than attacks because they reflected broken trust rather than partisan rivalry. The language used by former supporters emphasized betrayal rather than opposition. Organizational responses mirrored that ambivalence. Statements avoided outright condemnation but withheld unconditional defense. Calls for reflection and accountability signaled distance without disavowal. In political terms, that space is often more dangerous than open hostility because it allows doubt to harden quietly. Media coverage followed a similar pattern, emphasizing verification and balance while highlighting the core contradiction. The framing shifted from a dramatic confrontation to a broader question about leadership and integrity. Polling data that emerged afterward reflected this reframing, capturing erosion not just in approval, but in belief. The most damaging metric was not favorability, but perceived authenticity. By the time a primary challenger emerged, the narrative had already crystallized. Her biography was presented as a counterexample, not through attack, but through contrast. Everyday choices became symbolic markers of alignment between rhetoric and reality. The simplicity of that framing resonated because it echoed the questions raised in the auditorium. Attempts to defend herself in subsequent media appearances struggled against the weight of accumulated examples. Contextual explanations could not fully resolve the central tension because the issue was not ignorance, but expectation. Being held to a high standard is often framed as unfair, yet that standard had been self-imposed through years of moral language. Reframing scrutiny as persecution did little to restore trust. The primary loss was not just electoral, but narrative. The story that had propelled her rise depended on difference, on the promise that she was not like others in power. Once that promise was questioned, the brand faltered. The margin of defeat reflected how thoroughly that belief had eroded. In the end, the night at Georgetown mattered because it illustrated a broader lesson about political movements built on moral urgency. When leaders ask for sacrifice, they implicitly volunteer themselves as examples. Any visible deviation becomes magnified because it threatens the coherence of the message. Hypocrisy, whether perceived or real, is uniquely corrosive because it collapses distance between ideals and identity. What unfolded was not a takedown engineered by an opponent, but an exposure enabled by alignment between audience values and presented evidence. Johnson did not create the contradictions, he curated them in a setting where they could not be ignored. The consequences flowed not from his questions, but from the answers that failed to satisfy. That distinction explains why the damage lingered long after the lights in Gaston Hall were turned off. What made the aftermath so unforgiving was that the questions raised that night did not fade with time, but instead deepened as more people revisited the details on their own terms. Students who had been in the room began pulling the same public records that had been cited, not because they distrusted the presentation, but because they wanted reassurance that it had been misleading. For many, that reassurance never arrived. Each verification reinforced the same uncomfortable conclusion, that the tension they felt in the hall was not manufactured, but earned. The digital spread of the footage accelerated this reckoning in ways traditional political crises rarely do. Multiple angles, unedited clips, and raw audience reactions circulated without mediation, allowing viewers to experience the discomfort almost as if they had been there. The most shared moments were not insults or walkouts, but pauses, hesitations, and unanswered questions. Silence, it turned out, was more damaging than argument, because it invited interpretation rather than rebuttal. Within progressive online spaces, the tone was markedly different from the predictable outrage that accompanied conservative attacks. The language was quieter, more introspective, and more personal. Many posts framed their disappointment as grief rather than anger, describing a sense of having lost something they believed was rare. The emphasis was not on policy betrayal, but on moral inconsistency, a distinction that mattered deeply to a base that had invested emotionally as well as politically. This reaction exposed an underlying vulnerability in movements that center identity and virtue as much as policy. When credibility is built on being different, on rejecting the norms of political comfort and self-interest, any evidence of convergence with those norms becomes disproportionately damaging. Supporters who tolerate compromise on legislation often feel far less forgiving when compromise appears in lifestyle or ethics. The Georgetown exchange crystallized that dynamic in a way few events had before. Institutional responses reflected this shift. Advocacy organizations that had once amplified her messaging chose instead to emphasize principles abstractly, without direct endorsement. Their statements avoided naming names while underscoring values like accountability and transparency, signaling alignment with ideals rather than individuals. In political terms, this distancing was subtle but consequential, as it removed the protective buffer that often shields high-profile figures during controversy. Media coverage followed suit, focusing less on the confrontation itself and more on what it revealed about the broader movement. Articles contextualized her rise within a culture that rewards visibility and moral clarity, then questioned whether those rewards create incentives that are difficult to sustain. The framing suggested not a personal failing alone, but a structural tension between activism and governance, one that demands constant negotiation. Polling data translated these abstract concerns into measurable outcomes. Declines in favorability were significant, but the more telling figures were those tracking trust and authenticity. When respondents were asked whether she practiced the values she promoted, skepticism outweighed confidence by a wide margin. For a politician whose appeal rested heavily on perceived integrity, that metric was devastating. The emergence of a primary challenger capitalized on this erosion not through attack, but through contrast. Her campaign messaging avoided direct reference to the Georgetown incident, instead foregrounding everyday routines and modest choices as implicit rebuttals. Riding public transit, living within means, and emphasizing ordinary constraints became symbols of alignment rather than mere biography. The simplicity of this narrative proved effective because it mirrored the questions that had unsettled supporters in the first place. Attempts to regain footing through media appearances revealed the limits of contextual defense. Explaining structural constraints or systemic complexity did not address the emotional core of the criticism. For many former supporters, the issue was not whether her choices were understandable, but whether they undermined the moral authority with which she spoke. Once that authority was questioned, technical explanations felt beside the point. There was also a temporal element to the backlash that compounded its severity. The speed with which the narrative shifted left little room for recalibration or reflection. In an environment where responses are expected instantly, hesitation reads as evasion, and nuance struggles to compete with clarity. The Georgetown exchange had provided a clear frame, and subsequent attempts to complicate it failed to dislodge that initial impression. As the primary approached, the campaign faced a dilemma common to figures built on symbolic resonance. Doubling down on the original message risked appearing tone-deaf, while pivoting risked validating the critique. Each response was scrutinized not only for content, but for sincerity, and the margin for error narrowed with every appearance. The movement that had once amplified her voice now listened with folded arms. The eventual defeat reflected more than dissatisfaction with a single incident. It signaled a broader recalibration of expectations among progressive voters, particularly younger ones who had grown wary of performative politics. The margin underscored how quickly loyalty can dissolve when trust erodes, especially among constituents who view political engagement as an extension of personal ethics rather than transactional allegiance. In the months that followed, commentary about the episode often focused on its dramatic elements: the confrontation, the walkout, the viral clips. Yet, the more enduring lesson lay beneath the spectacle. The event illustrated how moral narratives function as both engines of mobilization and sources of vulnerability. When leaders position themselves as exemplars, they invite scrutiny, not just of their ideas, but of their lives. The speaker's role in this story was paradoxical. He did not persuade the audience to adopt his policy positions, nor did he convert them ideologically. His impact came from facilitating a reckoning that aligned with their own values. By presenting information without overt moralizing, he allowed the audience to reach conclusions independently, a strategy that proved more effective than confrontation. This dynamic explains why the fallout persisted even after partisan noise subsided. The questions raised were not easily dismissed as attacks from an opposing camp, because they echoed concerns voiced internally. The movement's self-image had been challenged using its own standards, and that challenge required response regardless of its source. The broader implication extends beyond any single figure. As activism increasingly intersects with personal branding and visibility, the boundary between message and messenger continues to blur. Audiences conditioned to expect authenticity become adept at detecting dissonance, and their tolerance for it diminishes accordingly. The Georgetown incident became a case study in how quickly symbolic capital can depreciate when credibility falters. In reflecting on the episode, it is tempting to frame it as a morality play with clear villains and victims. Yet such framing oversimplifies the forces at work. The pressures of national politics, media attention, and constant advocacy create incentives that complicate even the most earnest intentions. Recognizing those pressures does not absolve contradiction, but it contextualizes the difficulty of sustaining moral absolutism within systems designed around compromise. Ultimately, the night mattered because it transformed abstract concerns about hypocrisy into a lived experience for those who had invested most deeply. It was not the speaker's questions alone that altered perceptions, but the audience's recognition that those questions resonated with their own unease. That recognition proved impossible to reverse. By the time the primary concluded, the narrative had settled into something quieter and more durable than scandal. It was a story about expectation, trust, and the cost of moral leadership. The movement did not abandon its goals, but it recalibrated its faith in those who claimed to embody them. The Georgetown Auditorium returned to hosting lectures and concerts, its brief role in political drama already fading from campus memory. Yet for many who sat in those seats, the lesson endured. Demanding sacrifice is easy when it is abstract. Living it publicly, under scrutiny, is far harder. And when the distance between the two becomes visible, no amount of explanation can fully close it. What lingered after the noise faded was not the spectacle itself, but the structural reality it exposed about modern political power. Institutions no longer collapse under external attack, so much as they buckle under internal contradiction made visible. In that sense, the Georgetown episode was less a scandal than a stress test, one that revealed how fragile authority becomes when it is built on moral alignment rather than procedural legitimacy. When credibility functions as capital, even small withdrawals can trigger a run. The system did exactly what it is now designed to do. It amplified the fracture until it became unavoidable. The role of media in this process was not overtly adversarial, but it was decisive. Traditional outlets verified and contextualized, while social platforms accelerated and emotionalized, creating a feedback loop neither side could fully control. There was no single editorial line dictating the outcome, only a convergence of clips, data, and reactions that reinforced one another. The absence of mediation meant the audience became its own fact-checker, judge, and jury. That decentralization is now a permanent feature of political life. What made the damage enduring was that it did not depend on agreement with the speaker's politics. Viewers did not need to accept his ideology to accept the records he presented. The confrontation bypassed partisan filters by appealing to standards already internalized by the audience. In doing so, it demonstrated how power can be exercised indirectly, not by persuasion, but by reframing expectations. The most effective challenges today often arrive disguised as questions rather than arguments. This episode also illustrated the limits of performative alignment in an era of total visibility. Political figures are no longer evaluated solely on votes or speeches, but on the coherence of their entire public footprint. Consumption patterns, personal associations, and lifestyle choices are now interpreted as political signals, whether intended or not. Once values are articulated publicly, they create a lens through which all subsequent behavior is judged. Consistency becomes not just desirable, but mandatory. Institutions, for their part, responded predictably by retreating into abstraction. Statements emphasized principles over people, accountability over allegiance, signaling a preference for survivability rather than confrontation. This is how systems preserve themselves when individuals falter. By decoupling ideals from personalities, organizations protect the broader project even as they allow specific figures to fall away. It is a cold logic, but an effective one. The redistribution of trust that followed did not result in disengagement, but in recalibration. Supporters did not abandon climate justice or economic reform, but they reassessed who could credibly carry those banners. The emergence of alternative voices was less a rebellion than a search for alignment between message and messenger. Power did not disappear. It shifted laterally, toward figures perceived as less encumbered by contradiction. That fluidity is now a defining characteristic of political movements. From a structural perspective, the speaker's intervention revealed how asymmetrical power can be exercised without formal authority over the space. He did not control the event, the institution, or the audience, yet he shaped the outcome by understanding the incentives of visibility. By choosing a forum dense with believers rather than opponents, he maximized the impact of doubt. It was a reminder that power often lies not in who speaks loudest, but in who speaks where. The episode also underscored a broader transformation in how legitimacy is constructed. Traditional legitimacy flowed from office, party, or institutional backing. Contemporary legitimacy flows from perceived authenticity and alignment with stated values. That shift empowers outsiders and disruptors, but it also raises the cost of inconsistency. Once authenticity becomes currency, it is subject to market volatility. Importantly, the outcome was not predetermined by malice or conspiracy. The disclosures existed regardless of who cited them, and the questions resonated because they aligned with existing unease. The confrontation did not invent hypocrisy, it curated it. In doing so, it highlighted how much political fate now depends on narrative coherence rather than policy mastery. Substance remains necessary, but it is no longer sufficient. As the dust settled, the institutions involved returned to normal operation. Universities hosted new speakers, media outlets chased new stories, and political organizations adjusted their endorsements. Yet, the lesson persisted beneath that surface continuity. Visibility without coherence invites scrutiny, and scrutiny without satisfactory resolution accelerates decline. The cycle is impersonal, almost mechanical. In the end, the Georgetown night was not about a single politician losing power, but about how power is now lost. It slips away through cumulative dissonance rather than decisive defeat. It erodes when the distance between declared values and observable behavior becomes narratively legible. Once that distance is mapped publicly, reclaiming authority becomes extraordinarily difficult. The modern political arena rewards clarity and punishes contradiction with equal intensity. Media ecosystems amplify both, often without regard for intent or context. Institutions adapt by prioritizing resilience over loyalty. while audiences recalibrate trust continuously. This is not a moral judgment, but a structural reality. What remains is a quieter understanding of how movements survive and fail. They endure not because their leaders are flawless, but because their leaders remain believable within the standards they set. When belief falters, institutions move on, narratives reconfigure, and power finds a new host. That process may feel brutal, but it is now routine. The Georgetown Auditorium was simply one place where that routine became visible. For a few hours, the abstractions of politics collapsed into a single question about alignment. When that question went unanswered, the system responded accordingly. In contemporary politics, that is often all it takes.